We're driving through a lot of hunting land right now, and just a little trip into town, so I wanted to knock out a video and wanted to talk about a really important topic, and that's finding a deer hunting parcel. And whether you're looking for land just to knock on a door and find permission, or you're actually looking for land to purchase or even lease, depending on, there's a lot of different levels of resources you have to spend, depending on, especially if you buy land. It's an incredible investment. And I see people with hunting land all the time. That's what I do for a living. I look on their hunting land, I scout their hunting land, and you see the same things over and over again. But I want to help you find the best type of whitetail habitat. A general rule to follow. Now, you can't have the water or the property underwater the entire time, especially October, November, December. That's really bad. I've been on some properties that flood, really bad. I've been on some that are seasonal dampness, so they can't plant food plots or can't dependably plant on food plots. And the number one reason that you don't want that property underwater and frozen is once that ice, you might have deer that live out in the swamp. There's little humps and little islands they can live on the property. As soon as that ground freezes, and as soon as there's a skim of ice on there, those deer don't like crashing through that ice. And I've seen deer literally leave a property. Now, incredibly rocky parcels, I've seen that too, where it's almost impossible for someone to actually put in a food plot because of the amount of stone that's in the ground. And so that can be a real difficulty too. But as long as we're not talking water and too hard a ground that you can actually work with lots of stones and boulders, then really it boils down to the lower the timber value, typically the better the whitetail and wildlife habitat. That's a general rule that you can go by. As long as it's not underwater, as long as it's not too rocky, then the lower the value of timber, the higher the wildlife value. A lot of people make the mistake of looking at it and going into it saying, wow, we have mature hardwoods, we have oaks. A woods full of oaks is a terrible whitetail and wildlife habitat. There's no cover. So not a good idea to buy land that's full of oaks. It's a very limited resource, acorns, and there's no cover. I see a lot of those types of places where deer will move in just for a week here or there, 2 or 3 weeks during the season, and then they're gone. They're back to the areas that actually hold cover and give them daytime browse. They don't want to eat acorns all the time. So that's one example, and it could be really high timbered out. Of course, hard maple, hard cherry, just a lot of worthless plants when it comes to traditional small game hunting, deer hunting, wildlife. And so I'm going to go through, there's several reasons why you really should look for poor timber value. And the first one we'll just talk about is cover. When you have high dollar timber, you have zero cover. Even if you're in that management phase where you're going through select cut and you're select cutting your woods and you're doing that every 7 to 10 years, maybe you're creating clear cuts, pockets that all rotate back together into another cutting phase in 60 years. For one, the cover overall can be poor because the amount of cover is always changing. The type of cover that you have, the type of browse that you have is always changing. It's always getting older. You have a new cover, but number two, it's always changing location. So if you're relying on hardwood regeneration or hardwood timber production to supply your cover, you're really going to be lost when it comes to defining this is where deer should bed, this is where wildlife should hold, this is where I then should create food sources, this is how I should access the land, locate tree stand locations, blinds, and how I can actually build a parcel without spooking deer and spooking wildlife and actually have a property that's full of wildlife because you have quality cover on it. One of the things that I see, if it's low timber value, that usually means young timber, poor timber value, poor habitat. And a lot of times that boils down to you have a great upland mix. You have shrubs, conifers, grasses, briars, small clusters of trees and growth. That's the number one type of habitat. You have incredible diversity. And when it boils down to it, a lot of times when you have that type of diversity, you'll have open pockets that you can actually create immediate food plots in. The worst type of property is a property you have to buy and bulldoze food plots into hardwoods. And a lot of times you're going to have hardwoods some type of management of the hardwoods, and they're going to have food plots. You have nothing in between. You have to add all that. It's very expensive. So when you already have a good diversity on your land, you're probably going to have the ability to put in food plots immediately without a lot of work, and that's a really good thing. Trust me, I've had plots bulldozed in the UP in Michigan, and one tree at a time, pushing it over and clearing. And in the end, you're not left with a lot of diversity because you're doing this in hardwoods, and at the same time, it can be really costly. So really watch your food plot space. That's why I love, if I had a 40-acre parcel and I was buying at 10 acres of ag land, that's outstanding if I didn't overspend and I don't have to actually let a farmer rent that ground. I want to convert all 10 acres to deer habitat. Much, much better than buying 80 acres as 40 acres of ag land, and you have to rent 35 of it just to pay the bills. You're better off getting a smaller chunk and being able to convert all of those whitetail and habitat acres, unless you're just purely buying the property for investment, and then that's another video. That's not wildlife and whitetail. It's just purely investment. That's a different kind of story if you're looking for an income capitalization, income producing property. So food plot space is critical. Now, cost of wildlife and whitetail conversion. When you have all hardwoods and you have high timber value, for one, you're removing timber value by making openings and creating bedding areas that should stay bedding areas and timber production. But two, it's just incredibly costly. I've been on properties literally where the bill for the cost of clearing the land and miles of trails and 20 acres of food plots was well over $100,000, and really, really expensive to do that, as opposed to buying a land that's diverse and has a good diversity of habitat and mix of habitat that you can just install food plots in right away. Also, changing the diversity. So if you have a monoculture of hardwoods, the cost to turn that and convert it into actual quality whitetail and wildlife cover that has a diversity of conifer and briars and shrubs and hardwood regeneration and fields and switchgrass and openings and food plots is just incredible. The amount of planting is just not just the cost of a dollar cost, but a resource of time too. So, and what I find when you're converting that high dollar property into, quote, whitetail and wildlife, mega parcel, it takes much longer. It could take 10 years, 15 years, because there's so much you have to wait for it to fill in. And it's the slowest form of property to find good whitetail success, and it costs the most to get there. And in the end, let's say 12, 15 years down the road, you're going to be still behind that same size property in the same area that you could actually experience a diversity of habitat and had that diversity right off the bat to begin with. And when we're talking diversity, let me give you a little clue when you're looking at property. Great properties should have an uneven canopy, down to grass, up to shrubs, up to conifers, up to hardwood regeneration, back down again. When you have that uneven canopy across the land, that's a great signal that the property is probably a really good one. You can see a lot of this property even going by right now. I'm not really sure how you can see it, but you can just see right up through the woods. It's really open and a really high percentage of hardwoods, let alone maybe the timber value is not that great, but there's a lot of pole timber in there where you can look right up the hillside. And so there's kind of a mix. We're talking about hardwood and actual dollars per acre on timber production. Now, edge and diversity. What I really like about complex deer parcels when I go to look at them and scout them is when there's swamps, various types of edge of habitat, age of habitat, topography, then it creates a lot of edge, not only that diversity is created too, but because of that, then you can follow those lines of habitat change along a swamp edge, an elevation change, benches, habitat change lines, age of habitat change lines. Let's say you have clear-cut pockets for bedding areas. You can hit those outside lines and those bucks are going to cruise there, and there's logical progressions on the property that you can say and look at a property and say, this is going to be, I know deer are going to travel from point A to point B because of this habitat change. That's why I like hunting on public land in big habitat diversity. Some people have said, Well, I don't know where the deer are coming from because I hunt in the middle of the hardwoods. Well, I wouldn't hunt there. I would literally hunt on the edge of the hardwoods, on the edge of the swamp where more habitat types come together. That's where you find deer. And when you find low value timber and low value settings with upland settings, early successional growth, you find not only the best whitetail habitat, but the best wildlife habitat. You have to have that edge. Whitetails are creatures of edge, but so is a lot of other wildlife when it comes to grouse, pheasants in fields, rabbits, needing that thick cover and that high stem count. High stem count is a briar patch. Think about all the stems that cover an acre, even a switchgrass field. Hardwood regeneration, poplar, 7,000 shoots per acre. That'd be 7,000 shoots for the stem count per acre with that popple slashing, not counting briars and everything else that might be in there. So edge and diversity is critical. And then overall wildlife value, and you don't have the responsibility of managing that mature timber. I see a lot of people that get almost trapped. They buy this 80-acre chunk of good hardwoods, maple in Michigan, up north, a good stand of oak, whatever it might be, some cherry, and now you're left with, okay, I need to make 18 acres of clear-cut pockets. I need to select cut this, and I need to replant conifer to diversify. I need to open up fields. Well, you're destroying the timber value. You're taking that timber value away. And I see people that are almost trapped into managing. They end up, every decision they make has to do with, what are we doing with our timber value? They start to equate that value and recognize it. And now their wildlife potential and whitetail potential suffers drastically because they feel they've been put in a position where they have to manage timber instead of whitetail and wildlife, which whitetails and wildlife was the whole reason you went into buying land, finding land, leasing it, choosing that right piece for hunting. So it all goes back to often the worst timber value is the best whitetail and wildlife value. And I want you to think about that going forward in your decisions during this off season and finding the perfect whitetail hunting parcel this off season. Now, as we transition into habitat season, I hope you've had a chance to check out my web class, How to Design Your Whitetail Parcel. It's on my website, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com. I have a link in the description, and I hope you can find it, check it out, and enjoy it this year.